The footman reached her before the music did. She had climbed only 6 of the 40 marble steps of Wenlock House when the man in burgundy livery came down to meet her, and she knew by the particular gentleness of his face that he had been sent to be kind about something that would not be kind at all. Behind him the great doors stood open on a sea of light. 400 candles, a chandelier the size of a carriage, the warm gold roar of an aristocratic ball at its full height, and the smell of beeswax and hothouse lilies came down the stairs to her like a country she had once lived in and been turned out of. "Forgive me," the footman said. He did not quite look at her shoes. That was how she knew it was the shoes. Lady Rosamond Carlyle stood very still on the cold marble and let her gaze travel, without hurry, up the stair to the man who had sent him. The Duke of Wenlock stood 3 steps above the doorway in black and deep burgundy, a glass of wine forgotten in his white-gloved hand, and he was looking down at her feet with the expression of a man who has found a stain on a thing he keeps clean. He had seen the mend before he had seen her face. She understood that with perfect clarity. He had seen the left slipper, gray kid, borrowed that very evening from a lady's maid, the toe darned across with thread a half shade too dark, and he had raised one finger, and the music had gone on, and the footman had come. What the Duke did not know, what no soul in that blazing room could have guessed, was that 11 years before, on a wet gray afternoon under a draper's awning, a shivering girl had given her only dry glove to a stranger who turned out to be a queen. And the queen had kept the glove. And the queen had never stopped looking for the child who gave it. But that is the end of the matter, and we are at the beginning. The candles were guttering. The whispers were already starting their long run down the length of the ballroom, and the proud man on the stair had not the faintest idea whom he had just turned from his door. Let us go back and tell it properly. Lady Rosamond Carlyle was 22 that summer, and she had been poor for exactly 7 years. She remembered the day the poverty began, the way other women remembered a wedding or a death, which, in its way, it was both. Her father, Frederick Carlyle, Earl of Avenel, had been a quiet, scholarly, unworldly man who loved his library and his daughter, and his honor, in roughly that order, and who had been ruined by a charge of treason that he had not committed. A packet of letters, forged in a hand very like his own, had been laid before the proper authorities by a man who owed the Earl money and wished the debt to die with him. The letters were clumsy. Anyone who had truly known the Earl could see they were clumsy. But the world does not examine a fallen man with care. It examines him with relief that the fall is not its own, and it turns away. The Earl was never tried in the end. He died first, of an apoplexy, the physician said, though Rosamond had always privately called it grief. And a man who dies under a cloud is convicted by the silence that follows. The great houses struck the name of Avenel from their lists. The invitations stopped. The creditors did not. By the time the lawyers had finished, there was no estate, no money, and no place in the world for a 15-year-old girl with a dead father and a soiled name, except the place the world keeps for such girls, the edge of someone else's table, useful and unpaid. That was how she had come to Mrs. Drummond. Mrs. Drummond was a wealthy widow of 49, with a great deal of money got in trade by her late husband, and a great hunger to be received by people who would never quite receive her. She had taken Rosamond on as a companion, out of pure Christian kindness, she told her friends, and for the Polish of the thing, she did not tell them, because a disgraced earl's daughter, however poor, knew how to address a marchioness, which fork to use at a dinner of 11 courses, and how to make a drawing-room of climbers look, by her mere presence among them, a half-degree more genteel. Rosamond was, in short, a piece of borrowed breeding, exactly as the slippers would be borrowed silk, and Mrs. Drummond used the one as carelessly as Cecily would lend the other. For 7 years Rosamond had folded shawls and read aloud and written the difficult letters and smoothed the difficult evenings, and she had done it without complaint and without groveling, because her mother, dead these 11 years of the same low fever that had nearly taken Rosamond too, had taught her one thing above all others on the last clear afternoon they had together. "A straight back costs nothing, Rosamond," her mother had said, turning a small garnet cross between her thin fingers, the cross she would leave to her daughter that same winter. "They can take the house. They can take the carriage and the name and the very rings off your hands. They cannot make you stoop unless you agree to it. Do not agree to it." Rosamond had not agreed to it, not in 7 years. She pressed her thumb, very lightly, to the little garnet cross at her throat. It was the one thing of value she still owned, and she wore it always, under the high collar of her gray wool by day, and at the open neck of the borrowed silk tonight, and she walked into a great many rooms with her chin level, that her own ruin should by rights have closed to her. But she had never, until tonight, been walked out of one. The invitation to the Duke of Wenlock's midsummer ball had not, of course, been addressed to her. It had been addressed to Mrs. Drummond, who had got it the way she got most things, by relentless usefulness to a hostess in need of subscribers to a charity. And Mrs. Drummond had brought Rosamond along the way. She brought her own good gloves, as a thing that made her look better. The plan, such as it was Cecily's. Miss Cecily Drummond was 20, with pale, prominent eyes, and a laugh that always came a half-beat too late, as though she were translating mirth from a language she did not speak. She had decided, with the flat certainty of a girl who has been told her dowry will buy anything, that she would become the Duchess of Wenlock. And she had decided that Rosamond, being older, poorer, and far better looking, was to be kept dim beside her, the way a paste brooch is set off by being pinned next to a real one. So when the carriage was nearly at the door, and Rosamond's own slippers, 3 seasons old, worn through at the sole, had finally given way that very afternoon, it was Cecily who had said, all sweetness, "Oh, but you must not stay behind. You shall have a pair of mine," and had sent her maid down with a pair she knew quite well were not her own. They were Mrs. Pennock's. Mrs. Pennock was the lady's maid, a thin, anxious, decent woman of 50, who smoothed her apron flat with both hands before she dared say anything above her station, and who had smoothed it 3 times that evening before she found the courage to whisper, on the dim back stair, "My lady, they're mine. The slippers. Miss Cecily gave me hers 2 winters past, and these are what The toe's been mended, my lady. I did it myself. You can scarce see it by candle, but, oh, I did try to find you another pair." She had pressed the gray kid slippers into Rosamond's hands as though they were an apology she had no right to make, and Rosamond, who could have stayed home, who perhaps should have stayed home, had looked at the frightened, kind face of a woman with even less in the world than she had, and had not had it in her to refuse the gift and shame the giver. "They are lovely, Mrs. Pennock," she had said, and meant the woman and not the shoes. "Thank you. No one will be looking at my feet." She had been wrong about that, as it turned out. One man had looked at nothing else. The ball had been splendid. Rosamond would give it that much, even after. Wenlock House was one of the great houses of the age, and the Duke kept it like a regiment. Every candle trimmed to the same height, every footman of the same height as the candles, the marble so polished that the chandelier hung twice, once above and once drowned in the floor. They had come up the stair in the press of arriving guests, Mrs. Drummond working the rings up and down over her knuckles in her excitement, Cecily already laughing at nothing, and Rosamond a half-step behind them, in her pale dove silk that had been fashionable the year before her father died. She had felt the gown's age, as one feels a draught, not painful, only present. The waist sat an inch wrong for the year. The sleeve was a season's-old cut, but it was clean and well kept, and it had been her mother's notion of how a gentlewoman dressed, which was to say, with restraint. And Rosamond had pinned her dark auburn hair in the simple low knot her mother had favored, and put on the garnet cross, and looked at herself in Mrs. Drummond's cheval glass, and thought, not with vanity, but with a kind of armor, I know how to stand in a room like this. They cannot take that. At the top of the stair, where the Duke received his guests, the line had moved fast and bright. The Duke of Wenlock was 34 and unfairly handsome, tall, lean, dark-haired, with a clean, austere jaw and cool blue-gray eyes that moved over each arriving face and assigned it, instantly and without apparent effort, a precise place in the order of things. Rosamond had watched him do it to the 3 parties ahead of them. A flick of the eyes, a fractional bow calibrated to the visitor's exact rank, a word or two, and on. He smoothed his already flawless lapel between guests, a small unconscious habit, as though even the most correct of evenings required a man to keep himself perpetually in order. Mrs. Drummond he received with the bare minimum the law of hospitality required. Cecily he received with a half-degree more, his eyes touching her dowry's worth of diamonds, and finding them, for the moment, sufficient. And then Mrs. Drummond, in the caring voice she used when she wished to be overheard being grand, said, "And may I present Lady Rosamond Carlyle, who is so good as to companion me." And the Duke's cool gaze came down at last to Rosamond. It did not reach her face. It stopped at her feet. She would think of it many times afterward, the exactness of it, how his glance went straight down the pale dove silk to the hem, and past the hem to the gray kid slippers, and stopped on the left toe where Mrs. Pennock's careful darning showed, by the unkind brilliance of 400 candles, a half shade too dark against the kid. She watched his face do something very small and very cold. The handsome features did not twist. That would have been beneath him. They simply closed, like a door shutting on a draft from the servants' part of the house. "Carlyle?" he said. "The name of her ruined father," said flatly, as a thing remembered and disliked. "I think there is some error in your party, madam." This to Mrs. Drummond, not to Rosamond. One did not address an error directly. He lifted one white-gloved finger, no higher than a man might lift it to summon more wine, and 2 footmen detached themselves from the wall as though they had been waiting. "My people will see the lady to her carriage." The whole exchange had taken perhaps the length of a single bar of the music. That was the cruelty of it, Rosamond thought afterward, not its violence, but its smallness. He had spent more words on the diamonds. The room had heard. That was the design. A man does not turn a woman from his ball at the foot of the stair, in the full blaze of the candles, if he wishes it to go unremarked. He does it there precisely so that it will be seen, so that every other guest will understand the standard of the house and be grateful to have met it. The whisper started near the door and ran the length of the ballroom faster than Rosamond could have walked it. A long, hissing ripple of fans and turned heads. Who is she? The Carlyle girl, the trader's daughter. Look at her shoes. Look, look! And Mrs. Drummond, who would have defended a parcel of her own goods to the death, dropped Rosamond's company as one drops a hot coal, and turned her ringed hands and her plain niece toward the Duke with a laugh of pure social terror, disowning the connection before it could stain her. Cecily laughed too, the half-beat late catching up to her at last. Rosamond did not look at them. She looked at the Duke of Wenlock, who had already turned to receive the next guest, having forgotten her as completely as one forgets a name one never meant to keep. And she pressed her thumb, once, to the small garnet cross at her throat. Her mother's cross, her mother's voice, a straight back cost nothing, and she gathered the borrowed silk in one hand, and she turned, and she walked down the 40 marble steps between the 2 embarrassed footmen with her chin exactly level and her eyes dry, while the whole gold roar of the ball burned at her back. At the bottom, where the great doors gave onto the wet night, the footman who had been kind murmured, low, so that only she could hear it, "It is not." "We are only told, my lady. I am sorry for it." And Rosamond, because she had been raised to it, and because the man's shame was real, gave him the smallest possible inclination of her head, gentlewoman to servant, absolving him. Then she stepped out under the dripping portico into the rain. There was no carriage for her. Mrs. Drummond's was not to leave for hours, and Rosamond would not have got back into it for the world. She drew her thin shawl about her shoulders, and she walked down the last of the steps onto the streaming pavement, and she stood a moment under the iron lamp while the cold came through Mrs. Pennock's borrowed slippers, and she let herself feel, for exactly as long as the rain took to soak the darned toe, the full weight of what had been done to her. Then she lifted her chin and went to find a hired carriage, and did not look back at the house. She did not yet know, how could she, that on the far side of London, in a quiet room she would never have dared imagine entering, a woman was at that very hour turning a worn child's glove between her fingers, and saying to the lady who attended her, for perhaps the 100th time in 11 years, she would be grown now, a young woman. I should so very much like to find her. To understand the glove, we must go back further still, 11 years, to a girl of 11 and a rainstorm. Rosamond had been the daughter of an earl then, in the days before the fall, and she had been in town with her mother for a week of dressmakers and aunts. They had been caught out one gray afternoon by a sudden, drenching summer storm in a narrow street of drapers and glovers, and the Carlisle carriage had been sent round to fetch them. And while they waited for it, Rosamond's mother had gone into the glovers after a pair of mittens, leaving the child a moment under the striped awning with the cold rain hammering down a hand's breadth beyond her toes. There had been another person under the awning. A young woman, not so very old, Rosamond had thought, perhaps 25, alone, which was strange, and very plainly dressed in good gray wool, which was stranger, for the gown was plain in the way that only the very finest things are plain, with no ornament at all, and every seam perfect. The young woman had no carriage that Rosamond could see, and no maid, and she was shivering, and she had lost or forgotten her gloves, for her hands were bare and red with the cold, and she kept them pressed together in a way that was somehow more dignified and more pitiable than any complaint could have been. Rosamond had been raised by a mother who believed that kindness was not a thing one weighed first. She had a single pair of gloves with her, gray kid, child size, with the right thumb darned where she had worn it through climbing the orchard wall, and her mother had mended it with her own hand by the fire. One was wet through, fallen in a puddle as they ran, but the other, the left, was dry, tucked safe in her sleeve, and the strange young woman was shivering, and her bare hands were red. Rosamond had not thought about rank, because she did not yet know there was any reason to. She had peeled the dry gray glove from her own hand, and held it out across the little space between them, and said, "You may have mine, if you like. It is only the one, and it is mended at the thumb, but it is dry, and it is wool inside, and you are cold." The young woman had looked at the glove, and then at the child, with an expression Rosamond had never forgotten, and had never, until much later, understood. A sort of startled stillness, as though she had been handed something far larger than a glove. "That is very kind," she had said at last, and her voice was low and beautiful, and very carefully even. "But it is your own glove. Will you not want it?" "I have another hand to keep in my muff," Rosamond had said reasonably, "and you have none at all. Please. My mother would be ashamed of me if I let you stand there cold." And the young woman had taken the small darned glove and drawn it onto her own slender hand, where it did not quite fit, and had held that hand a moment against her cheek, as if to be sure of the warmth. "What is your name?" she had asked. "Rosamond," the child had said. "Rosamond Carlyle. My father is the Earl of Avenel, but you needn't curtsy. We're under an awning." The young woman had laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And just then, A plain-clothes carriage had come up at the curb, very fast, with a coachman who jumped down with an air of enormous relief and said, "Ma'am, we have been searching the whole of—" and had stopped himself, and bowed very low indeed, much lower than a coachman bows to a lady in plain gray wool with no maid. And the young woman had stepped up into the carriage, still wearing the child's mended glove, and had leaned out once before the door was shut and said, "I shall not forget you, Rosamond Carlyle." And the carriage had gone. Rosamond had told her mother about it, when her mother came out with the mittens. And her mother had said only that it was very right to have given the glove, and had not made much of the carriage. And within a year, the low fever had taken her mother, and within 7, the world had taken everything else, and the strange, grateful young woman under the awning had become one of those small, bright fragments of childhood that a person keeps without quite knowing why. Rosamond had never learned who she was. She had been a child. She had not read the signs. She had not known that a young woman who travels the streets of London, plainly dressed and unattended, and is searched for by a great many frightened servants, and bows from no one and is bowed to by all, is generally only one sort of person in the world. She had not known that she had given her glove to the Queen, but the Queen had known. The Queen, in those days, had been newly come to her throne, hemmed about with ministers and ceremony, and the vast machinery of a crown, and had slipped her household for one stolen private hour the way a prisoner slips a watch, and had been caught by the rain, and shamed by her own helplessness, bare-handed and cold, and unable even to find her own carriage, and had been rescued not by any of the 100 sworn to serve her, but by a child of 11 who did not know her, and gave her the only dry thing she had. The Queen had worn that glove home. She had had it cleaned and mended, where the child's own mending had begun to fray. And she had put it in a small lacquer box on her writing table. And across 11 years of a long reign, she had turned it between her fingers, when the weight of the crown pressed, and had thought, "Somewhere there is a girl who was kind to me when she had nothing to gain and did not know who I was, and I have never been able to thank her." She had tried, quietly, because a queen cannot send criers through the streets after a glove. She had set discreet people to find a girl named Rosamond Carlyle, daughter of the Earl of Avenel, and they had brought back word that the Earl of Avenel had died disgraced and ruined, the estate gone, the family scattered, and that the daughter had vanished into that gray country where ruined gentlewomen go, which is to say, into other people's houses, under other people's names of employment, beneath the notice of the world that keeps lists. The trail had gone cold, but the Queen did not let it go. Twice a year she asked, and the worn gray glove sat in its lacquer box and waited, as small mended things do, to matter. Now, back to the living world, and to the morning after the ball. Mrs. Drummond was not a cruel woman by design, only a frightened and an acquisitive one, and her cruelty took the form of pretending that nothing had happened. She came down to the breakfast room the next morning, full of the ball, the supper, the orchestra, the Duke's particular attentions to Cecily, which existed chiefly in Mrs. Drummond's imagination, and she addressed Rosamond as though Rosamond had spent the evening pleasantly at home, working the rings up and down over her knuckles all the while, calculating, Rosamond could see, exactly how to keep the useful companion without ever admitting the companion had been wronged. "You were quite right not to stay, Rosamond," she said at last, around the edge of her chocolate. "With your slippers in such a state, so sensible, one does not wish to be conspicuous." And she had looked, for one flickering instant, almost ashamed. And then the shame had been too uncomfortable, and she had reached for the toast, and the moment had passed. Rosamond said nothing. She had learned the great usefulness of saying nothing. She pressed her thumb to the garnet cross beneath her collar, and poured Mrs. Drummond's second cup, and asked, in a level voice, whether they were still to go down to the country in a fortnight. For there was a country scheme. This was the part Rosamond had not yet understood the danger of. The Duke of Wenlock had a great estate in the country, Harlow, and a house party was to gather there at the end of the season. A long, gilded 3-week affair of shooting and cards and dinners, the very heart of the marriage market, where mothers brought daughters to be looked over at leisure. Mrs. Drummond had secured an invitation for herself and her niece through the same dogged usefulness as before, and she meant to spend 3 weeks throwing Cicely across the Duke's path until he tripped over her. And she meant, of course, to bring Rosamond, to write the letters, and arrange the flowers, and make the climbers' party look genteel, into the very house of the man who had turned her from his door. "He will not know you," Cicely said, with the bright unkindness of a girl who has never in her life been told no. "Men of that sort never look twice at a companion. You shall be quite safe, and you can keep my gloves in order. You do it so much better than Pennock." She laughed her half-beat late laugh, pleased with her own generosity in noticing Rosamond at all. It was Lord Marcus who first saw her for what she was. Lord Marcus Ashby was the Duke's younger brother, 28, easy where his brother was austere, warm where his brother was cold. He had not been at the midsummer ball. He had been in Leicestershire about a horse, and so he came to the country gathering at Harlow with no notion that the slender, composed, dark auburn companion in the high gray wool gown had ever been turned from his brother's house. He noticed her, the first evening, for the ordinary reason that she was the most quietly elegant woman in a room full of women trying very hard to be elegant loudly. And he noticed her, the second evening, for a far less ordinary reason, which was that he had watched her translate under her breath and without being asked a line of Horace that a bishop had got wrong at the dinner table, correcting the cleric's Latin so deftly and so privately, only for the ear of the girl beside her, that no one was embarrassed, and the thing was simply, quietly, right. Lord Marcus had a habit, when he disagreed with something but had decided to hold his tongue, of turning the heavy signet ring on his finger with his thumb. He turned it now, watching her, because he disagreed very much with the way the whole room was treating this woman as furniture, and he was, for the moment, holding his tongue. But not for long. He was not a man who held his tongue for long. He found her the next afternoon, in the long library, at Harlow, where she had been sent by Mrs. Drummond to fetch a particular novel, and had instead been caught, helplessly, by the books. For the late Duke had been a great collector, and there were things on those shelves that Rosamond's father had owned once and lost, editions she had read at 12, and grieved at 15, and she was standing with one of them open in her two soft hands, very still, when Lord Marcus came in. "You read Greek," he said. Not a question. He had seen the spine. Rosamond closed the book without haste, and set it back exactly where it had stood. "My father taught me," she said. "It is a poor accomplishment in a companion. I beg your pardon, my lord. I was sent for a novel, and forgot myself." "Your father taught you Greek," Lord Marcus said slowly, "and Horace, and the proper precedence of a Spanish grandee over an English baron, which you settled for Lady Cushing at dinner on Tuesday, when she had it backward, and the whole table was about to embarrass itself. And you keep Mrs. Drummond's accounts, I'm told, to the farthing, and write her letters in a hand a duchess might envy." He tilted his head. "Who taught a lady's companion all that, miss? I am sorry, I have not been properly told your name. They only ever say, Mrs. Drummond's young lady." "Carlyle," said Rosamond, after the smallest pause, watching to see whether the name would do to him what it had done to his brother. It did nothing. He had been in Leicestershire about a horse. "Miss Carlyle," he repeated pleasantly, and bowed, and that was all. And Rosamond understood, with a small private ache, that this was how it ought to have gone at the top of the stair, that there had been nothing about her in the least unworthy of a civil bow, and that the difference between this brother and that one was not breeding, but the simple decency of looking at a person's face before her shoes. If you have come this far into Lady Rosamond's story, you will understand why I have stayed by her so long in the cold and the rain. Stay with her a while yet. Settle in and let the candle burn down. For what is coming is the part I have been most waiting to tell you. The slow turning of the proud and the long memory of a queen. Now, to the library and the gallery above it, where a man stood listening whom Rosamond did not know was there. For the Duke of Wenlock had heard the whole of it. He had come up into the gallery that ran above the library to find a parliamentary report he wanted, and he had been standing in the shadow of the upper shelves, half a floor above, when his brother had come in and begun to talk to the companion, and the Duke had stood very still, meaning at first only to wait until they had gone, and had found himself against every intention, listening. He had heard her name, Carlyle, and known it, and felt the old cold contempt rise, the traitor's daughter, the mended shoe, the error in the party. And then he had heard her voice go on, low and clear and unhurried, talking of Greek and of her dead father, and he had heard in it something that did not fit the slot he had assigned her at all. He had heard breeding, not the bought, anxious imitation of it that filled his house party, Mrs. Drummond's loud grandeur, Cecily's brittle laugh, but the real thing, the thing he had been raised inside, and could detect the way a wine merchant detects a vintage in a single swallow, the unforced ease of a person who has never had to wonder which fork, the learning of a house with a great library, the particular straightness of a back that has been straight since the nursery. He had turned a woman from his door for the crime of a darned slipper, and here that same woman stood below him, correcting his brother's Greek with the carelessness of a scholar. And the Duke of Wenlock, who prided himself above all things on never being wrong about rank, felt the first cold finger of a suspicion he did not at all enjoy, that he had been very wrong indeed. He smoothed his lapel. He went back to the parliamentary report, but he did not read it. And below, neither he nor Rosamond nor Lord Marcus saw the other small thing that happened at Harlow that same evening, the thing that would matter more than all the rest. A letter came for the Marchioness of Brent. The Marchioness of Brent was the grandest guest at the gathering, 56, a great hostess of the old school, and though few of the climbers around her knew it, one of the small handful of women whom the Queen called friend rather than subject. She had come to Harlow partly to oblige the Duke, whom she had known since he was in short coats, and partly because she missed nothing, and a house party is an excellent place to miss nothing. She had been watching Rosamond for 2 days, with the quiet attention of a woman who taps a closed ivory fan once against her palm before she renders a verdict, and she had not yet rendered it, but she was close. The letter that came for her bore a particular cipher in the wax, a cipher that made the footman who carried it tread softly, and the Marchioness read it twice by the candle in her own room, and then she sat very still for a while, and then she looked through the open door and down the passage to where a slender figure in gray was carrying a branch of candles to light an old climbing woman to bed, and she said, to no one, very quietly, "Well, there you are." But she said nothing to Rosamond. Not yet. Some things must be done in their proper order, and there is an order even above a duke's. The next 3 weeks at Harlow were the strangest of Rosamond's life, for she was being courted by no one and watched by everyone, and she knew the why of none of it. The Duke of Wenlock began to be present in rooms she was in. It was done with great subtlety. He was a subtle man. He did not speak to her. To have spoken to the companion would have been to admit she existed in the social sense, and he was not yet ready to admit anything, but he arranged, in a dozen small ways, to be where he could observe her. He came to the music room when she was turning pages for the company, and listened to her give, when pressed, one short song in a low, true voice, and then fall silent, and refuse to be coaxed into a second, which was precisely what a gentlewoman of taste would do, and precisely what no fortune-hunting girl in the room had the restraint to do. He watched her at cards, where she played a careful, honest, unshowy hand, and once, quietly, declined to take advantage of an old gentleman's blunder, correcting his count in his favor at the cost of her own. He watched her with the servants, who had begun. He noticed this. He noticed everything. To treat her with the deference they gave to none of the paying guests, because servants always know. And the more he watched, the more the slot he had put her in cracked and gave, and the more it cracked, the more uneasy he became, for the Duke of Wenlock's whole edifice of himself rested on the certainty that he could read rank at a glance, and he had read this woman as refuse, and put her out in the rain. He smoothed a great many lapels that fortnight. It was Lord Marcus who finally said it to him, plainly, one night over the brandy after the others had gone up. "You turned her out, didn't you?" he said. It was not a question. "At the midsummer ball, I heard it from Cushing. Lady Rosamond Carlyle. You had the footman walk her to a carriage that wasn't there, over a pair of borrowed shoes, in front of 400 people. And now you cannot stop looking at her, because you have finally noticed she is the only real lady in this house, full of pretend ones, and it is eating you alive." The Duke turned his glass slowly in the firelight. "Her father was a traitor," he said. "Her father," said Lord Marcus, "was acquitted by death of a charge that was never proven, on letters half the bar thought forged. You know that, as well as I do. You simply preferred a clean story to a true one, because a clean story is easier to keep off our own name." He set down his glass, and turned his signet ring once with his thumb, and looked at his brother with an affection that did not spare him. "You are so afraid of taint, Julian, that you have got cruel. Father's scandal frightened you when you were a boy, and you have spent 20 years scrubbing this family so white that you cannot bear a darn thread in the same room. But that woman has more honor in the way she carries a branch of candles than half the peerage has in its veins, and you put her out in the rain. I should be ashamed, in your place. I am ashamed, and I wasn't even there." The Duke did not answer, but he did not sleep either, and in the morning, for the first time, he found a reason to speak to her directly. A stiff, correct, almost painful little exchange about a book she was returning to the library. And Rosamond answered him with a cool, level courtesy that gave him not 1 inch, that treated him exactly as a gentlewoman treats a man who has wronged her and not yet earned the right to be forgiven, with flawless manners and no warmth at all. And the Duke of Wenlock, who had never in his adult life had to earn anything from anyone, went away from that small exchange feeling, for the first time, the precise size of what he had thrown away. But the worst was still to come for Rosamond before the best. The lowest point always comes before the turn. It came through Mrs. Drummond and through money, as such things so often do. There had been, some months before, a small debt, a milliner's bill, a matter of £15, run up by Cecily on a whim and never paid, and the milliner, grown tired of waiting, had at last sent a man to Harlow itself to dun for it, which was a mortification Mrs. Drummond could not endure under the Duke's roof. And Mrs. Drummond, working the rings frantically up and down over her knuckles, had done a small, mean, frightened thing. She had told the milliner's man, and then told the house, that the debt was not Cecily's at all, but the companion's, that Lady Rosamond Carlyle had ordered the goods and never paid, as disgraced people will. It was a lie, and a stupid one, and it would not have survived an hour's real inquiry. But it did not need to survive an hour. It needed only to be said in a great house full of people, primed to believe the worst of a traitor's penniless daughter. And it was believed. Rosamond found herself, within a single day, the subject of a new and uglier whisper than the one at the ball. Not merely shabby now, but dishonest. A companion who ran up debts in other people's names. Exactly the sort of thing one expected. Mrs. Drummond, to protect the lie, grew cold to her and let it be understood that she had been most deceived in her young person. Cecily, delighted, embroidered, and Rosamond, who could have defended herself, who knew precisely whose hat the bill was for, discovered that the truth would cost more than the lie. To clear herself, she must publicly accuse her employer's niece of the debt and her employer of the slander, in the Duke's house, as a penniless dependent against a rich one. And even were she believed, she would be turned off without a character, and a gentlewoman of 27 without a character and without a name has, in this world, precisely one road left, and it is not a road her mother would have wished her to walk. So she paid it. That was the lowest point. She had 15 pounds of value in the world, and it hung at her throat. She took her mother's garnet cross to the nearest town on the housekeeper's market day, on the pretext of an errand, and she sold it to a pawnbroker for 11 pounds, and made up the rest from the 4 pounds she had saved in 7 years against exactly such a day. And she paid the milliner's man herself, in full, and asked him for a receipt, and folded the receipt away, because she did not yet know how, but she meant one day for the truth of it to be known. And she came back to Harlow with nothing at her throat at all. That evening, dressing for dinner, her hand went up of its own habit to press the cross before she went down to a room full of people who believed her a cheat, and found bare skin, and Rosamond Carlyle stood very still before the small glass in her small room, with her thumb pressed to the empty place at her throat where her mother's cross had hung for 11 years. And for one moment the straight back her mother had given her trembled. A straight back cost nothing, her mother had said, but it had cost, in the end, everything she had left to sell. She pressed her thumb harder to the bare place, as if the cross were still there, as if her mother's voice were still there. And it was. That was the thing. The voice did not need the cross. And she straightened, and she went down to dinner with her chin level, and faced a room full of people who thought the worst of her, and gave them not the satisfaction of a single tear. The Marchioness of Brent watched her do it from the head of the table, and tapped her closed ivory fan once, very softly, against her palm. The verdict was rendered, and the very next morning the Marchioness wrote a letter of her own, sealed it, and sent it by her own man, fast, to London, to a quiet room with a lacquer box on the writing table. Things moved quickly after that, though Rosamond did not know they were moving at all. The season ended. The house party broke up. Mrs. Drummond carried her niece and her wrong companion back to town for the last weeks before everyone scattered, and Rosamond went on folding shawls and writing letters with nothing at her throat, and the whisper of dishonesty trailing after her now wherever Mrs. Drummond's circle went. She bore it. She had borne worse. But it was a gray time, the grayest of all her gray times, for she had lost the last thing of her mother's, and she could see no door at all in the long, blank wall of her life. And then, on an ordinary morning in early autumn, a carriage stopped at Mrs. Drummond's door that was not an ordinary carriage. Rosamond saw it from the window where she sat darning Cecily's gloves. There was always darning. She thought sometimes she had spent her whole ruined life mending small gray things, and she did not at first understand what she was looking at. It was a plain closed carriage, very fine, with no crest she could name, but the horses were matched to a perfection she had not seen since her father's day, and the coachman and the footman wore a livery so quietly magnificent, so entirely without ostentation, that it took her a moment to understand that this was not the absence of grandeur, but its very summit. A footman came to the door. A knocking sounded through the small house. Mrs. Drummond's voice rose in the hall, gone suddenly high and uncertain, and then the parlor door opened, and Mrs. Drummond stood there, white as her own lace, and said, in a voice Rosamond had never heard her use, "Lady Rosamond, there is a person has come for you." The person was a lady. She was perhaps 60, upright, plainly and exquisitely dressed, with a face of great composure and kind, shrewd eyes, and she came into the small parlor as though small parlors were of no consequence to her one way or the other, and she looked at Rosamond, at her face, first and last, and only at her face, and held the look a breath longer than civility required. "You will not know me," the lady said. "I am the Marchioness of Brent. We were a little under the same roof at Harlow, though I do not think we were ever made known to one another." She tapped a small, closed ivory fan once against her palm. "I have come to ask you a strange question, Lady Rosamond, and I will ask you to answer it plainly, and not to be afraid. 11 years ago, when you were a child, did you, on a wet afternoon in a street of glovers, give your own glove to a stranger sheltering from the rain? A gray kid glove, mended at the thumb?" The room was very quiet. Somewhere a clock ticked. Rosamond felt the question go through her like cold water, for she had not thought of that afternoon in years, and could not for her life see what it could have to do with anything, and she answered it the only way her mother had taught her to answer anything, which was the truth. "I did," she said. "She was cold and had lost her gloves, and I had a dry one. I never learned her name." She paused and pressed her thumb to the bare place at her throat where the cross was not, and added, "Because honesty required it. I have wondered, sometimes, what became of her." The Marchioness of Brent let out a small breath, as a woman does when a long-held hope proves true. "She became," she said, "a very great person indeed, who has been looking for you for 11 years, and who has at last, by the merest chance, and the sharp eyes of an old woman at a country house party, found you. Lady Rosamond Carlyle. Her Majesty the Queen has not forgotten the child who was kind to her in the rain, when she had nothing to gain by it, and did not know who she was. And she has asked for you, by name. There are silences and silences. This one Rosamond would remember to the end of her life. The Queen, she said at last, very carefully, as one repeats a word in a foreign tongue to be sure of it. The Queen, said the Marchioness, who has kept your glove these 11 years in a box on her writing table, and turned it over in the worst hours of her reign, and said to those of us who love her that she had been shown a kindness once by a child who wanted nothing, and could never find her to say so. You gave your glove to your Queen, my dear, and she has been searching for you ever since. And now she has you, and she means to thank you properly, which, for a queen, is no small thing." The Marchioness's shrewd eyes softened. "You are to be presented to her at the next drawing room at St. James's. I am to sponsor you, which I do most gladly. And there is more, which Her Majesty will tell you herself, for it is hers to tell." Behind her, Mrs. Drummond made a small, strangled sound, and began, helplessly, to work the rings up and down over her knuckles. But this is the reveal, and a reveal must be followed by its consequences, or it is only a trick. The Queen had found her companion. Now the companion must be raised before the very world that had cast her down, and the world, when it learned, would not be able to look at the Duke of Wenlock's part in it without seeing exactly what he was. The news could not be kept quiet, and the Marchioness did not try to keep it quiet, for half the point of a vindication is that it be witnessed. Within a week it was known throughout the town that the Marchioness of Brent, the Queen's own friend, had taken up the disgraced Carlyle girl. Within a fortnight it was known why, in a version that grew in the telling but kept its astonishing core, that the penniless companion turned from the Duke of Wenlock's ball over a darned slipper was the very child who had once, all unknowing, shown a private kindness to the Queen, and that the Queen had been seeking her for 11 years, and had her now, and meant to honor her at court. The effect upon the world that keeps lists was instantaneous and total. Mrs. Drummond, who had let it be understood that she had been deceived in her young person, now let it be understood, with equal energy and even less shame, that she had always known Lady Rosamond for a person of the first quality and had cherished her accordingly. A revision so brazen that even Cecily looked uncomfortable. The hostesses who had cut Rosamond discovered that they had always meant to call, and the whisper that had run down the Duke's ballroom, "Look at her shoes," the traitor's daughter, turned in a single week into a far more dangerous whisper that ran instead down every drawing room in London. Did you hear what Wenlock did? He turned her from his door. The Queen's own. He had her walked out in the rain over a borrowed shoe, and the queen has been searching for her for 11 years. The Duke of Wenlock heard it. Of course he heard it. He heard it from Lord Marcus first, who came to him not in triumph, but with a kind of grim quiet, and laid the whole of it out, and finished by saying only, "You turned the queen's own benefactor out of your house in the rain, Julian, because her shoe was mended. There is no scrubbing, that one clean." And then he left his brother alone with it. And the Duke of Wenlock sat for a long time in the cold, gray morning light of his own great house, the immaculate house he had kept like a regiment, scrubbed white against the smallest taint, and understood that he had, by his own hand, in front of 400 witnesses, committed the one act that the world he worshipped would never forgive. He had been cruel to someone the crown loved. The taint he had spent his life fleeing, he had now brought down on himself, and brought it down precisely through the instrument of his own pride. He smoothed his lapel. It did not help. There was nothing left to put in order. The disorder was inside him. He learned the full shape of his ruin at his club 2 evenings later, and it taught him more in a quarter of an hour than 30 years of being right had ever taught him. He had gone there out of habit, because a man in trouble goes to the places that have always told him who he is. And he had found, for the first time in his life, that they would not tell him. The porter bowed exactly as low as he had always bowed, and not a hair lower, which from a porter who reads the weather of a room better than any barometer was its own quiet sentence. In the great smoking room, the conversation did not stop when he entered. That would have been a mercy, a thing a man could meet. It simply went a half-degree cooler, the way a fire does when a window is opened somewhere out of sight. An earl he had known these 20 years gave him good evening with perfect civility, and then, a moment later, found he was wanted at the far end of the room. A pair of younger men he had once been pleased to patronize looked at him with a frank, appraising curiosity, as one looks at a great house the morning after a fire, to see how much of it is still standing. No one was rude. That was the whole of it. No one would ever again need to be rude to the Duke of Wenlock. The room had simply revised its estimate of him, silently and entirely, and he could read the new figure in every averted civility. He had turned a woman from his door to keep his name clean, and his name had never in his life been so soiled as it was now. Sitting alone with a glass he did not want in a room that had stopped seeing him as anything but a cautionary tale. He smoothed his lapel. The gesture which had ordered the whole of his life ordered nothing now, and he understood, sitting there, that there was no room he could enter, no list he could be restored to, no quantity of correctness that would ever scrub this clean, because the stain was not on his coat or his name, but on his soul, and only one thing in the world removes that kind of stain, which is to become, slowly and at cost, a different man. He set down the untouched glass, and went home, and did not sleep. And in the gray of the morning, he sent for his carriage, and went, of all the places a ruined duke might go, to an old solicitor's office. He did the first decent thing of his adult life that same day, and he did it, to his small credit, before he knew whether it would do him any good, which is the only kind of decency that counts. He went to Sir Henry Volt. Sir Henry Volt was an old solicitor, upright and dry, who had served the late Earl of Avenel and a dozen other great families, and who had a habit, before he said anything that mattered, of setting a paper down, face up on the desk, and squaring its edges precisely to the table's edge. The Duke had remembered. It had come to him in the long gray morning that there had been talk, years ago, of the Avenel letters being forged, that the case had never been proven, that someone, somewhere, had doubted, and he had set himself to find out, not because it would help him now, but because he had wronged the daughter and could at least, belatedly, stop believing the lie about the father. What he found, through Sir Henry, was more than doubt. Sir Henry Volt, it transpired, had never believed the charge for a moment, had quietly gathered over the years the proofs of the Earl's innocence, the true authorship of the forged letters, traced at last to the dead creditor's own clerk, a sworn deposition taken on a deathbed, the establishment beyond argument, that Frederick Carlisle, Earl of Avenel, had been an innocent man, hounded into his grave by a lie. Sir Henry had kept it all these 7 years against the day someone with the power to act on it should think to ask. No one ever had. The world does not reopen the case of a dead disgraced man. There is nothing in it for anyone. "You are the first person to ask me, Your Grace," Sir Henry said, and set the deposition down face up on the desk, and squared its edges to the table with his dry old hands. "In 7 years. The Earl was innocent. I have always known it. I could never make anyone care." He looked up, and there was something in the old eyes that was not quite reproach and not quite hope. "You can make them care. You have the standing. The question is whether you will do it for the right reason, or only to mend your own name. For she will know the difference, Your Grace. That young lady will know the difference to the hair." And the Duke of Wenlock, who had spent his life caring about exactly one thing, which was his own name, looked at the squared paper that could clear another man's, and made his choice. He cleared the Earl of Avenel's name first, before the court reveal, before he had any assurance of forgiveness, before there was any advantage left to be wrung from it. He laid Sir Henry's proofs before the proper authorities, and pressed, with all the weight of a duke, for the public correction of the record. And because a duke's weight is considerable, and the proofs were beyond argument, it was done. It was published. The Earl of Avenel was declared, posthumously and unequivocally, an innocent man, the victim of a forgery, his honor restored. The Duke paid the costs of it himself, and asked that his name be kept out, and Sir Henry, squaring one last paper, told him that he would keep his name out of the documents, but that he would not himself keep silent about who had finally asked, and the Duke said that was the old man's right. Rosamond learned of it, not from the Duke. She learned of it from Sir Henry Volt, who came to her at the Marchioness's house where she now stayed, and set the published correction down face up before her, and squared its edges to the table, and said, "Your father was an innocent man, my lady. I always knew it. It is in the record now, where it cannot be unsaid. The Earl of Avenel died with clean hands, and the world will say so from this day." And he told her, because she asked, and because he had said he would not keep silent, who had finally pressed the case after 7 years. Rosamond sat for a long time, with her thumb pressed to the bare place at her throat. Her father's name was clean. The thing she had not even let herself want, because it had seemed as far beyond reach as the moon, had been done, and done by the very man who had turned her from his door. It changed nothing about the door. But it was not nothing. She folded the paper very carefully, and she said to Sir Henry, in a voice that was steady because she made it so, "Thank you for keeping it. For all these years, when no one asked, that was its own kind of faith." And she did not yet say anything at all about the Duke. The drawing room at St. James's was held on a clear, cold morning in October. Rosamond had been dressed by the Marchioness's own people in a gown of deep candle-cream silk, simply cut, for the Marchioness had understood at once that to drape this particular young woman in jewels and furbelows would be to lie about her, and that her power was in her plainness, as it had always been. There was the long, anxious wait that all who are presented endure, the standing. One stands in the Queen's presence, in the great cold gilded rooms among the other women to be presented, the duchesses and the diplomats' wives, and the trembling debutantes. And Rosamond stood among them in her cream silk with nothing at her throat, composed, upright, her soft hands quiet, and waited to be called. And it must be said that the very room was full of people who had cut her. This was the exquisite design of it, though Rosamond had not designed it, and would not have dared. Half of fashionable London had contrived to be at that drawing room, drawn by the extraordinary story, and among them, because his rank required his attendance, and his dread compelled it, was the Duke of Wenlock, in the full dress of his order, standing where dukes stand, near the front, near enough to see everything. He had not spoken to Rosamond since Harlow. He did not know what the Queen meant to do. He only knew that the woman he had turned out in the rain was about to be received by the sovereign, and that he must stand and watch it, and that this was justice, and that he had earned every cold inch of it. The Lord Chamberlain, for it is the Lord Chamberlain who governs these things, who vets by station and character every soul that comes before the sovereign, and whose office had, on the Queen's own quiet instruction, made very certain room upon the list for one name, read out the names in their order, and then he read, Lady Rosamond Carlyle, daughter of the late Earl of Avenel, to be presented by the Marchioness of Brent. The name went through the room like a stone through still water. The late Earl of Avenel, the cleared name, the restored name, and Carlyle, the name of the mended shoe. And a long indrawn breath ran along the gilded walls, as 400 faces, many of them the very faces from the ball, turned to watch the traitor's daughter, the companion, the cheat, the shabby girl in the borrowed slippers, walk the length of the throne room to her queen. Rosamond walked it with her chin level. She had walked down 40 marble steps with the same carriage, between 2 footmen, in the rain. She found she could walk this. The Marchioness went before her. At the proper distance, she made her curtsy. The deep full court curtsy, executed with a grace that came not from a season's drilling, but from a nursery, and a mother, and a back that had been straight since she was a child. And she rose, and she lifted her eyes to the woman on the throne. And the Queen was looking at her with an expression Rosamond had seen once before, 11 years ago, under a draper's awning in the rain. A startled stillness, as though she had been handed something far larger than a glove. For a moment, the Queen did not speak the formal words. For a moment, she simply looked, and the whole vast room held its breath at the irregularity of it. A queen gone silent at a presentation. And then the Queen did a thing that had not been done at a drawing room in the memory of anyone present. She beckoned the young woman closer than the form allows, close to the very foot of the throne, and she said, not in the ceremonial murmur, but in a low, clear voice pitched to carry to the listening room. We have met before, Lady Rosamond, though I think you did not know me. And she turned, and from a small lacquer box held ready by a lady-in-waiting, she took out a worn gray child's glove, mended at the thumb, 11 years old and carefully kept, and she held it out across the little space between them, exactly as a child had once held it out to her. You gave me this, the Queen said, when I was cold, and you were a child, and you did not know who I was, and you had nothing to gain. I have kept it all this time. I have looked for you all this time. She laid the small gray glove in Rosamond's 2 soft hands, and closed Rosamond's fingers over it with her own, before the whole of the staring court. A kindness given to a stranger in the rain is the truest measure of a soul that I know. I have wished for 11 years to thank the child, who showed me mine was worth saving. I thank you now, Lady Rosamond Carlyle, before all my court, and I tell them that they may carry it out of this room to every drawing room in my kingdom, that you are dear to me, and that whosoever has done you wrong has done it to a person whom your Queen holds in her especial favor and her especial love. She did not name the Duke. She did not have to. A queen does not point. A queen lets the room point for her, and the room, 400 strong, did not turn its eyes to the Duke of Wenlock in that moment. It was far too well bred for anything so crude. But every soul in it knew, and knew that every other soul knew, exactly who had turned this woman from his door over a darned shoe. And the not looking was 1,000 times more terrible than any looking could have been. The Duke of Wenlock stood in the full dress of his order, and received, in perfect silence, the public ruin of his pride. And he did not flinch from it, which was the first thing he had done in the whole affair, that Rosamond, watching him without seeming to, found she could respect. And Rosamond Carlyle stood before her Queen with the worn gray glove of her own childhood in her hands, 11 years given back to her, her father's name clean, her dignity restored before the very room that had stripped it from her. And she pressed her thumb, once, to the small gray glove in her palm, the way she had so long pressed it to the cross that was gone, and she found she was not weeping, and she found she was not triumphant either. She was only, at last, seen. "Your Majesty does me too much honor," she said in her low, clear voice, "for a glove given by a child who would have been ashamed not to give it. But I am glad, more than I can say, that you were not cold for long." And the Queen smiled, and the thing was done, and the world had been turned exactly on its head in the space it takes to present a single lady at court. There remained the matter of the Duke. He did not approach her at St. James's. He had that much sense, and that much shame. But 3 days later, he came to the Marchioness's house, and asked, with a humility no one who had known him would have believed, whether the Lady Rosamond Carlyle would receive him. And Rosamond, after letting him wait the precise length of time that a man should wait who has turned a woman out in the rain, received him, in the morning room, with the door open, the Marchioness within call, on her own ground, and her own terms. The Duke of Wenlock came in, and bowed to her, as he should have bowed at the top of his stair. And for a moment, the proud man could not find his words, and he smoothed his already flawless lapel, the old gesture of a man trying to put himself in order before a thing he cannot control. And then he stopped doing it, deliberately, and let his hands be still, and spoke plainly, which Rosamond understood was, for him, the hardest thing of all. "I have come to ask your pardon," he said, "and I have no right to it, and I do not ask it expecting to be given it. I turned you from my house. I saw a mended shoe, and I did not trouble to see your face, and I had you walked out into the rain in front of 400 people, because your hem offended my notion of what was clean. I have been a proud man, and a cruel one, and I dressed the cruelty up as standards, and I have spent my whole life so frightened of any stain upon my name that I became the worst stain on it myself." He drew a breath. "I cleared your father's name. I want you to know that I did it before the drawing room, before I knew the Queen would, before I knew anything. I did it because it was true, and because I had wronged his daughter, and it was the one wrong in the whole affair that I had the power to set right. I did not do it to buy your good opinion. I tell you so only because you would always wonder, and you deserve never to have to wonder about anything again." Rosamond listened to the whole of it, with her hands quiet in her lap and her face composed. And when he had finished, she was silent a moment, and then she said, "I know why you did it. Sir Henry told me, and I believe him, and I believe you. Thank you. It is the greatest thing anyone has done for me in 7 years, and I will not pretend it is small." She paused. "But you must understand, Your Grace, that the clearing of my father's name is a thing between you and justice, and it does not purchase anything from me. You did not wrong my father. You wronged me, and that is a longer account, and it is not settled by a single morning's courage, however real." "I know it," he said. "I do not think you do." "Quite yet," said Rosamond, not unkindly. "You turned me out for a darned slipper. Do you know why I wore it?" And she told him about Mrs. Pennock, and the kindness of a frightened woman with less than nothing, and her own refusal to shame the giver by refusing the gift. "I was turned from your house," she said, "for the same quality the Queen has spent 11 years trying to thank me for. You and she looked at the same woman, Your Grace, on the same evidence, a small, gray mended thing, and she saw the whole of my soul in it, and you saw refuse. That is the difference between you, and it is not a difference a single apology mends. It is mended, if at all, only by years of proving you have learned to see." The Duke of Wenlock bowed his head. "Then give me the years," he said, very low. "I do not ask you to forgive me today. I do not ask you to take me at all. I ask only leave to spend a long time proving I am no longer the man who put you in the rain. And if, at the end of it, you find I have become someone you could esteem, I will count myself fortunate beyond anything my rank could ever have bought me. And if you never find it, I will have at least become a better man for the trying, and you will owe me nothing for it." And Rosamond Carlyle looked at the proud Duke who had at last learned to ask rather than command, and she did not fall into his arms, because she was not that kind of heroine, and this was not that kind of story, but she did not close the door either. "That is the right thing to ask," she said, "and it is the right way to ask it. You may call, your grace, as any gentleman may call upon a lady, no oftener than is proper, and no nearer than I allow. We will see what the years make of you." And that, for the moment, was all. And it was, for a man like the Duke of Wenlock, both the smallest mercy and the greatest he had ever been granted. But before we come to the years, there was the matter of the others, and justice does not forget the small cruel as it honors the great kind. Mrs. Drummond got exactly what such people get, which is not punishment, but exposure. The whole town now knew the truth of the milliner's debt. For Rosamond, freed at last of the fear of being turned off without a character, had quietly let the receipt she had kept be seen by the Marchioness, who let it be seen by the right two people, after which it required no further help. And Mrs. Drummond, who had built her whole brittle position on the appearance of respectability, found the appearance gone. She was not received. The hostesses she had courted for 20 years discovered that they had urgent engagements. Cecily's hope for marriage to a respectable gentleman quietly evaporated when his mother heard the story, and Cecily learned, too late, that a girl who laughs a half-beat behind everyone else is soon left laughing alone. They retired to Mrs. Drummond's house in the country, where they remained, and that was the whole of their portion, and it was enough. Mrs. Pennock fared rather better. Rosamond did not forget the frightened kind woman who had lent her the mended slippers and tried to warn her, and whose gift, despised by a duke, had set the whole great wheel of justice turning. When Rosamond's circumstances changed, as they now did, swiftly, for a young lady honored by the Queen does not long want for means or place. Almost the first thing she did was to send for Mrs. Pennock and offer her a position in her own household, at proper wages, with her own room and her Sundays free. And Mrs. Pennock, smoothing her apron flat with both hands and quite unable to speak, came gladly, and served Rosamond faithfully for the rest of her days, and never had to darn another slipper she could not afford to replace. And Sir Henry Volt, who had kept the truth for 7 years against the day someone would ask, found that the day had been worth waiting for. Rosamond saw to it that the world learned, after all, that the Earl of Avenel had had one faithful friend in his solicitor when he had no other. And the old man, who had squared the edges of a great many sad papers in a long career, lived to square the edges of a few glad ones at last. Now, the years. The Duke of Wenlock called, as a gentleman calls. He came no oftener than was proper, and no nearer than Rosamond allowed. And the first dozen calls were stiff and careful, and watched, and Rosamond gave him not 1 inch he had not earned. But the inches came, for he was, beneath the pride, an intelligent man, and not at bottom a bad one. And a man who has been shown the worst of himself in the clearest possible mirror has a choice to make, and the Duke of Wenlock made the harder and the better one. He changed, slowly, and at cost, and not all at once, but truly. She watched him learn to see. She watched him, at a great dinner, treat a nervous, ill-dressed young clergyman's wife with a particular gentle courtesy, drawing her out, putting her at her ease, and understood that he had done it on purpose, and for her, not to be seen doing it, but because he had taught himself a new way of looking at small, gray, mended things. She watched him quietly settle a pension on the family of a tenant the old Duke had turned off years before. She watched him when his own pride flared, for it did. A man does not unmake himself in a season, catch his own hand reaching to smooth his lapel and stop it, and master the flair, and speak plainly instead. The tenant was the truest test, and Rosamond happened to be by when it came, on a cold, bright day at Harlow in the second winter. It concerned a man named Wickham, old Tom Wickham, a small tenant farmer of 62, whose father and grandfather had held the same 40 acres of Wenlock land for 3 generations, and whom the late Duke had turned off 6 years before over a quarrel about a boundary hedge and a hot word spoken in grief. The season Wickham buried his wife. The old Duke had wanted the field. He had taken it, and a family that had lived on that ground for 90 years had gone to a laborer's cottage and a hired man's wages, and the thing had been forgotten by everyone but the Wickhams, as such things always are by everyone but the people they happen to. The Duke of Wenlock found the record of it going through his father's papers, and he did not have to do anything at all. The boundary was settled. The field was his. The law was entirely on his side. He sent for old Wickham instead. The farmer came up to the great house in his one good coat, twisting his hat in his hands, braced for some new trouble, for a summons from the great house had never in his life meant anything but trouble. And the Duke of Wenlock, who 2 winters before would not have known the man's name, came round from behind his desk, which Rosamond had never once seen him do for a duke, and said, "Mr. Wickham, my father did your family a wrong, and I have only lately understood the size of it. He took the long meadow from you over a hedge and a word spoken, when you had just buried your wife, and your people had farmed it 90 years. I cannot give you back the years. But the field is yours again, on the old rent, and the lease is drawn for 3 lives, and there is the matter of 6 years wrong, which—" and here the proud man's voice went, for a moment, not quite steady, "which I should like to make what amends I can for, if you will allow me. I am sorry, Mr. Wickham. My family has owed yours an apology for 6 years, and no one troubled to pay it. I am paying it now." Old Tom Wickham stood twisting his hat, and could not speak for a moment, and then said only, in the flat, slow way of a countryman who distrusts fine words because they have so often been the beginning of being cheated, "And there's no, your grace, there's no catch in it. There's always a catch, with the great house." And the Duke said, "There is no catch. There has been a catch your whole life, and it ends today. The field is yours, and the wrong is mine to mend, and you owe me nothing for it, not deference, not gratitude, not a single tugged forelock, only the rent, on quarter day, as your grandfather paid it." And the old man's weathered face worked, and he turned away to the window so that a duke should not see a grown man undone, and Rosamond, watching from the doorway, pressed her thumb to her mother's cross, and understood that the man she was learning to love had finally, truly, learned to see. For he had looked at a small, gray, forgotten thing, an old farmer in a worn coat, and had seen the whole of a wronged life in it, and had moved to set it right when nothing in the world required him to. Each small thing was a brick, and the bricks, over the better part of a year, built something Rosamond had not expected to be built. Not the old edifice of rank, but a man. It was nearly a year to the day from the drawing room when he asked her. He did not do it grandly. He did it in the Marchioness's garden, in the plain afternoon light, with no ring produced like a conjurer's trick, and no speech prepared. He simply said, "I have tried, for a year, to become a man you could esteem. I do not know whether I have succeeded, but I find I cannot any longer not tell you that I love you. Not your favor with the Queen, not the cleared name, not anything you can do for mine, but you, the woman who walked down my stairs in the rain with her chin level and never once asked me for pity. I would spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you, if you would have me, and if you would not, I would understand it, and go on trying to be worthy of you anyway, because you have made me wish to be a better man than I am, and that is a debt I will owe you, whether you take me or not." And Rosamond Carlyle, who'd been offered this past year a great deal, position, society, the favor of a queen, the suit of a duke, and who had taken her time over all of it, because she had learned, in 7 hard years, that the first person a woman must choose is herself, looked at the man the Duke of Wenlock had made of himself, and found that she had, somewhere in the long, careful year, come to love him too. Not the Duke, but the man who had wept inwardly at his own cruelty and gone, before there was any profit in it, to clear a dead man's name. She pressed her thumb once to her throat, where her mother's garnet cross hung again now, for the Duke had quietly redeemed it from the pawnbroker months before, and returned it to her without a word or a condition, the very first of all his bricks, asking nothing, only that she have her mother back. And she said, "I will have you, Julian, not because you are a duke. I have learned that a title is a small gray thing too, and may be despised or treasured by the soul that wears it. I will have you, because you became a man who can see. But understand me, I come to you whole, and chosen, and free, and not rescued. I was never helpless. I was only poor, which the world mistakes for the same thing. You are not saving me. You are joining me. There is a difference, and I will have you know it to the hair, all our lives." "To the hair," said the Duke of Wenlock, who had learned at last what the words were worth. "All our lives." They were married quietly in the spring, in a small chapel and not a great cathedral, by the lady's own wish. And the queen, who does not commonly attend the weddings of her subjects, sent in her stead a single gift, which was the small lacquer box. Empty now, the worn gray glove returned at last to the woman who had given it, with a card in the queen's own hand that said only, "It found its way home. Keep it, and remember that the smallest kindness is never lost." And Rosamond kept the glove, but she did not put it away in the box. She had it framed, the worn gray kid with the darning at the thumb, and she hung it in her own morning room where she would see it every day. And beside it, in time, she hung nothing, but kept on the small table beneath it her mother's garnet cross when she was not wearing it, so that the two small gray treasured things, the glove a queen had kept and the cross a mother had left, sat always within sight of one another. Here, then, is the epilogue for those who have stayed to the end and who deserve to know what became of the life she built. The Duchess of Wenlock, for so Rosamond Carlyle became, in the fullness of time, and wore the title lightly, as a thing of no more weight than the woman beneath it chose to give it, did not become, as the world half expected, a great cold ornament of society. She became something the world had less language for. She used her place, and her means, and above all, the curious and lasting favor of the Queen, for the unfashionable purpose of seeing the unseen. She founded and kept on the Wenlock land a house for the daughters of ruined gentlemen, girls like the girl she had been, well-born and well-taught and suddenly penniless, who in the ordinary way of the world would have vanished into other people's parlors under other people's terms, dim and useful and unthanked. She gave them a place to be poor with dignity, while they found their feet. She saw them taught and placed, and where they wished it, married for love, and not for bread. And she did it without the smallest air of charity, because she remembered exactly how charity felt from the other side, and she had sworn the morning she pawned her mother's cross that if she ever had the power, no gentlewoman within her reach would ever again have to sell the last of her mother to pay another woman's debt. The Duke worked beside her in it, which was not the least of the changes in him. The man who had once kept his house scrubbed white against the smallest taint, kept it now full of exactly the small, gray-mended people he had once turned from his door, and was the better and the warmer for it, and knew himself to be, and once a year, on the anniversary of a certain midsummer ball, he and his Duchess held an open evening at Wenlock House, to which the only invitations sent were to people the great world overlooked, governesses and companions and poor relations and faithful servants, and the candles were trimmed all to the same height as before, 400 of them, but no one in all that blaze was ever turned from the door for the state of her shoes, and the Duke received each guest himself, at the top of the very stair, and looked, every time, deliberately and first at the face. Mrs. Pennock grew old in their service and was buried when her time came, with her Sundays free and her wages paid, and a stone the Duchess chose herself. Lord Marcus married a sensible woman who laughed exactly on the beat and remained his brother's truest friend, and turned his signet ring rather less often, having less to hold his tongue about. Sir Henry Volt's old firm kept the family's papers for 2 generations more, and squared their edges, and the Earl of Avenel's name stayed clean in the record, where his innocent friend had at last got it written. And the Queen, who had begun the whole of it, 11 years in a rainstorm before, by being cold and helpless, and kind enough to take a child's only dry glove, kept Rosamond near her to the end of a long reign, not as a courtier, but as the one person at her court who had been good to her, before there was anything to be got by it, and who could therefore always be believed. They were friends, the Queen and the Duchess, in the careful, guarded way that queens are permitted friends, and more than once, in the hard hours that come even to the throne, the Queen would send for Rosamond, and they would sit a while, 2 women who had each been cold and helpless once, and shown a mercy that outlasted everything. And the worn gray glove that had passed between them in the rain hung framed in the Duchess's morning room across the whole of both their lives, a small, mended thing that the proud of the world had once despised, and that 2 women, a queen and a duchess, knew for what it truly was. For the world looks at the hem, and the toe of the shoe, and the cut of last year's silk, and renders its quick, cruel verdict. And now and again it is given to a soul to look instead at the face and the hands and the small gray mended things a person carries, and to see, in a darned thumb or a borrowed slipper, the whole truth of who is standing before it. The Duke of Wenlock had to be taught that, the hard way, before 400 witnesses and a queen. Rosamond Carlyle had known it since she was 11 years old, and cold beneath a draper's awning. A straight back costs nothing, her mother had told her, turning a small garnet cross between her thin fingers, on the last clear afternoon they ever had. They cannot make you stoop unless you agree to it. And Rosamond never had agreed to it, not down 40 marble steps in the rain, not at the pawnbroker's counter, not before the whole staring court. And in the end, the world she had refused to stoop to was the world that rose, at the asking of a queen, to honor her by name. That was tonight's chapter from Candlelit Chapters. If her story moved you, if you would have given the glove and kept your chin level on the stair, then snuff the candle gently and stay a while in the quiet, and tell me in the comments whether you think the Duke ever truly earned her. And then join me when the candle is lit again for the next.